In the quiet suburbs of Frederick, Colorado, a story unfolded that would leave the world asking how a man could erase an entire future before it even began. In just one morning, a smiling family vanished, and with them, a baby boy who was never given the chance to take his first breath. This isn't just the story of what Chris Watts did. It's about what the autopsy would later reveal about the unborn child at the center of it all. On August 13th, 2018, Shanann Watts returned home from a business trip in the early hours of the morning. She was 15 weeks pregnant, glowing in photos she'd shared online, openly talking about the baby she and Chris had named Nico. Hours later, she was gone. When Shanann missed a doctor's appointment and stopped answering calls, alarm bells went off. A close friend reported her missing, and police arrived at the Watts home expecting answers. Chris stood at the door, calm, cooperative, insisting his wife and daughters had simply gone out. As investigators walked through the house, nothing looked disturbed. The beds were made. The car was still in the garage. Shannon's purse and phone hadn't moved, yet something felt wrong. Neighbors spoke of odd behavior. Surveillance footage showed Chris backing his truck into the driveway early that morning, something he rarely did. While he pleaded for his family's safe return on television, cracks were already forming in the image of the worried husband. If you're following this case for the first time or want deeper breakdowns like this, take a moment to subscribe, like, and share. It helps keep these stories told with the detail and respect they deserve. As the search intensified, attention turned to what Chris wasn't saying. Behind the rehearsed words and forced concern was a timeline that didn't add up. And while the world focused on Shanann and her two little girls, few realized there was a fourth victim, one whose story would only emerge later, through a medical examiner's report that revealed a truth almost too disturbing to confront. Days after the disappearance, the search for Shanann and her children led investigators to a remote oil field in Weld County, a place tied directly to Chris Watts' job. What they found there stripped away any remaining hope. Shannon's body was discovered buried in a shallow grave, face down in the dirt, her body showing clear signs of a violent death. Not far away, investigators would later recover the bodies of her daughters, Bella and Celeste, hidden inside separate crude oil tanks. The image of a father using his workplace to conceal his family's bodies stunned even seasoned detectives. Shanann was transported to the medical examiner's office, where an autopsy would begin to answer the questions her silence could not. The findings were devastating. She had been strangled, her cause of death ruled a homicide. But as the examination continued, another tragic reality emerged. Shanann had been 15 weeks pregnant, and during the autopsy, the medical examiner documented the presence of fetal and placental tissue connected to her body. The unborn baby boy she had named Nico was no longer safely carried within her. Due to the time that had passed and the condition in which Shannon's body was found, the fetus had begun to decompose along with her. Forensic reports noted that the unborn child could not be examined as a separate, fully intact body in the way her daughters were. Instead, Nico's remains were documented as part of Shannon's autopsy findings, a detail that would later raise questions, confusion, and emotional reactions from the public once those reports became known. This wasn't just a medical detail buried in paperwork. It was the quiet confirmation that Nico had died with his mother, his life ending before it had truly begun. While the world focused on the horror inflicted on Bella and Celeste, this forensic revelation revealed a deeper layer of loss, one that would soon collide with the limits of the law and expose how justice struggles to define a life that was never born. As the autopsy findings became public, another question quickly followed. How would the justice system recognize a life that ended before birth? For prosecutors, the answer was complicated. Colorado law draws a strict legal line. Homicide charges apply only to victims who are born alive. No matter how clear the intent or how devastating the outcome, the death of an unborn child is treated differently under the statute. That meant Nico, though deeply wanted and already named, could not legally be counted as a murder victim in the same way as his mother and sisters. Instead, investigators documented Nico's death as a direct result of the killing of Shanann. Prosecutors added a separate charge, unlawful termination of a pregnancy, acknowledging that the unborn child's life had been taken, even if the law did not allow the word murder to be used. When Chris Watts ultimately pleaded guilty, that charge stood alongside 3 counts of first-degree murder, silently underscoring that there was more loss than the headlines first suggested. For many following the case, this distinction was hard to accept. To the family, to friends, and to the public, Nico was already a son and a brother, not a legal technicality. Online discussions exploded, with some asking how a crime could erase an entire future and yet fall into a legal gray area. Others pointed out that this wasn't about sympathy for Watts, but about how the law was written long before this tragedy ever happened. If you've been following closely so far, take a second to like the video. It helps stories like this reach people who want the full picture, not just the surface details. As the case moved towards sentencing, Nico's existence remained present but undefined, mentioned in court documents yet never given the same legal weight. And while the courtroom sought closure, the family was left with something far heavier: the knowledge that one life would always be remembered, even if it could never be fully counted. After the court proceedings and guilty plea, attention shifted from evidence and statutes to grief, the kind that doesn't fit neatly into legal language. Funerals were held in North Carolina, where Shanann had grown up, and the services became a public outpouring of shock, sorrow, and unanswered questions. Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were laid to rest together, their caskets placed side by side, a visual reminder of how completely one family had been erased. Nico, though never born, was spoken of alongside them, his name included in prayers, eulogies, and the quiet moments shared by those who loved them. Details about how Nico's remains were handled were not widely publicized, and that absence of clarity sparked speculation online. Medical examiners typically follow strict procedures when fetal remains are involved, documenting and preserving them as part of an autopsy before releasing them according to legal and family arrangements. While official reports focused on forensic necessity rather than ceremony, many close to the family expressed the belief that Nico was ultimately buried with his mother and sisters, allowing him to rest where he had always belonged. The lack of a separate autopsy report for Nico fueled misunderstanding. Some assumed it meant his life was overlooked, when in reality, it reflected the limits of forensic examination at that stage of pregnancy. Still, the emotional impact was undeniable. For Shannon's parents, siblings, and friends, Nico was never a footnote. He was the child they had been waiting for, the name they had already whispered into the future. As media coverage faded and the headlines moved on, the family was left to grieve in private. And yet, Nico's story continued to echo, not in courtroom arguments or autopsy language, but in the unresolved feeling that something precious had been taken without ever being fully seen. Even years after the tragedy, the story of Nico Watts, the unborn child of Shanann and Chris Watts, continues to spark difficult questions about life, loss, and the limits of the law. His death, intertwined with one of the most notorious murder cases in recent American history, has become a focal point for discussions about fetal rights, legal definitions, and how society recognizes lives that are never born. While the law drew lines that prevented Nico from being counted as a homicide victim in court, public awareness and family memory ensured he would never be forgotten. Advocates for legal reform have cited Nico's case as an example of why laws surrounding fetal victims are often inadequate. Some argue that statutes should evolve to protect unborn children in situations where intent and circumstance clearly indicate that a life was taken. Others caution that such changes must balance ethical and legal complexities, highlighting that every case brings unique challenges. The tragedy of Nico and his family demonstrates how legal definitions sometimes fail to capture the emotional and moral weight of a crime. For the Watts family, memory and mourning have become the way to preserve Nico's existence. Friends and relatives continue to speak his name, honor the life that could have been, and grapple with the sorrow of what was lost. Public retellings of the case, from documentaries to investigative reports, often include him as a part of the narrative, ensuring that viewers recognize the full scope of the tragedy. In doing so, they remind us that even the smallest lives can carry immense meaning. As you reflect on this story, consider the delicate balance between justice, law, and human empathy. Nico's life, though never lived outside the womb, became a symbol of innocence lost and the importance of remembering every victim, regardless of age. If you found this story moving or informative, take a moment to like, subscribe, and share, and leave a comment to honor Nico's memory and the lives of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. This case remains a haunting reminder that behind every headline, there are layers of truth, grief, and unanswered questions. And that sometimes, the most important stories are the ones that continue to echo long after the court doors close.